Back-to-school savings are officially in session at Tanger Outlets. Shop tax-free August 2nd through 6th and save up to 70% off the latest school styles. The best of apparel, footwear, accessories, and more. Save at Nike Factory Store, American Eagle, Gap Outlet, Crocs, Under Armour, Banana Republic Factory, and hundreds more. There's always something happening. Discover the latest fun and events all season long. Tanger Outlets, your savings destination.
You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Archaeo Animals. Today we'll be talking about sheep and goats. Alright, so welcome again to Archaeo Animals. This is episode 4. And I don't know. It's been a very long day. And today we'll be talking about sheeps. Oh my gosh. Sheep. Sheep? Is that the plural?
Oh, they don't mind, I'm sure.
I just generally realized, it's sheep, isn't it? Sheep and goats. There we go. Sheep and goats, would you say they're pretty, common on sites?
Omnipresent.
Yeah.
That was going to be a pun, but I'm too drawn today for puns.
Oh my god, I just realized we never really introduced ourselves. I'm your host, Alex Fitzpatrick, and with me as always...
You don't want to know. It's Simona again, and actually in this episode we were going to have Kearney the rabbit as a silent spectator, but Sandy insisted that should come back on the show because, talking about sheep and goats is sort of the reason she's alive in the first place. Being a herding dog, and she's been poorly lately and all that, so we'll allow it. So just as a little, I forgot how to English as well today. As a disclaimer, if you hear random noises and scratching, I'm not being weird. It's just it's Sandy chipping in.
Well, yeah, we're an animal podcast. We have to have animals on the podcast as well, even if they're just really quiet.
Yeah, because I think we do get human guests every now and then, but it's maybe the staple is just the animal guest. It's got to be one every time.
Which, speaking of, we do actually have a guest this episode.
Yeah.
Yeah. But more on that later. So let's just start talking about sheep and goats, not sheeps and goats, because I know how to English now.
And I'm infecting you with my non-native speakerness.
No, I just don't think I ever learned, really. Anyway, so it kind of ties into domestication, which is what we kind of been talking about on and off in these last couple episodes. When you're dealing with domestic sites, farm sites, things like that, you're more than likely going to find sheep. So they're pretty prevalent on sites, specifically here in Britain. And, it makes sense. Sheep and goats. Why does that sound so weird to say? They produce a lot, which is why people in the past would have them on their sites.
Yeah, and I guess they're fairly easy-ish to look after. They sort of like to do their own thing. But the reason we've sort of grouped them together is because the sheep and goats are sort of a very prevalent sort of research topic in zoo archaeology sort of worldwide, just because of how much of a pain it is to tell the two apart. Because even though they're two distinct species, they are part of the same genus Ovis. So morphologically, they're similar enough to drive you ever so slightly insane when you got them in your assemblage.
Yeah, I want to say I don't think I've ever run into goat in my assemblage, but that could be that I'm just not noticing it. Because, like you said, they do look almost exactly the same, to the point that it really has been a kind of a contentious topic among zoo archaeologists.
But there's definitely a lot of work being done, sort of, especially in recent years. But I guess it's one of those things that is probably the case that British economy, or just economy in the British Isles, has been mostly centred around sheep. But of course, there's also the question of how much of goats have just gone like misidentified and just put down as sheep because that's what we expect. So like we, like inadvertently bias our sample because we do, oh no, sheep. I've done it plenty of times myself. Like I'll find, I don't know, like a metapodial or something, and my mind will just go straight to sheep and no, hang on, let's find out whether it's sheep or goat, sort of thing.
Well, yeah, again, though, like, it's just, we all kind of assume that we're going to find sheep at some point, again, especially here in Britain. So it's easy to just kind of be like, oh, that's going to be another sheep. And it could be a goat, honestly. I think the closest I ever got to almost having a goat was a horn core that I found in an assemblage, but I ended up just writing sheep because it just seemed more in shape with a sheep.
It's just a good old sheep/goat or ovicapra.
Yeah, ovicapra is the
proper term, I believe. But I'm not, because one of those things that with sheep and goats are telling them apart, the differences that are sort of very easily discerned without resorting to biometry or anything. What I'm trying to say is that there's very few elements sort of in sheep and goat that are easily distinguishable, that you find it during excavation, say, oh no, that's definitely goat. Or no, you might be able to, it just probably you're more knowledgeable than I am.
I would never ever say that. But just kind of like talking about like sheep and goats have kind of similar purposes as living creatures, though. I mean, they're known for their secondary products, which is why they're usually kept and domesticated. You've got wool, you've got milk, all that kind of stuff. And then, of course, you have meat occasionally.
Yeah, and apparently, like in certain regions, goats were actually used for traction.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, like, we'll get back to that, because I can't quite recall. Oh, no. Of course.
What?
It was mostly in settlements in Italy during the Roman period. The no was mostly to myself because, like, yeah, I swear I'm turning into a Roman archaeologist.
I thought something bad had happened, but I guess it is. Yeah, no, it is.
Unpopular opinion here, but I don't like the Romans. It's just it ever so happens.
Hot take.
It ever so happens that most of the remains that you tend to find on sites in Britain, I mean, the Romans are omnipresent. So I left Italy when I was 19, moved to Britain, did archaeology here. Who follows me? The Romans. So, like, no matter where I go, no matter where I look, the Romans will just, like, haunt me to the jaws of hell. Okay.
Oh
okay,
God.
sorry. We'll just rename the episode as the one where Simona loses it, and we'll move on.
To be fair, I feel like this podcast is turning into an anti-classical archaeology podcast, which we're not. But personally, I always found classical archaeology boring. But that's not the topic of this episode. But maybe it will be a topic of a bonus episode one day.
Well, tell you what, we'll get a guest that is a classical zoo archaeologist, and they'll be able to tell you all about it if you're interested. Because
we're not.
Yeah.
But yeah, okay, so going back to sheep and goats. So they do have very similar, are used for very similar reasons on site. So in a lot of ways, I mean, I don't want to say that it doesn't matter that we distinguish the two, but in like the grand scheme of things, I guess.
Yeah, and I guess the one thing why would be important is that to an extent, whether a settlement will have sheep or goats tell you something about the environment. Because the species, even though they're very similar, they're adapted to slightly different environments. And I guess like there's, with goats being more suitable to rougher terrain, while sheep kind of like to happily graze in
a field,
sloping hills and.
No, yeah, that's fair.
What an idyllic landscape I just painted. Oh, I'm a poet.
You're a poet, and I'm apparently a proponent of the laziest zoo archaeology ever. But no, you're right. I mean, it's the reason why we always should push for more detailed zoo archaeology analysis in general. But yeah, no, definitely. So kind of moving on a bit, what else would you say sheep and goat remains tell us about sites, besides the fact that it was probably a domestic site?
Well, I guess, again, as you mentioned earlier, we're looking at sort of, with sheep and goat, again, we can gain inference on the type of economy that was practiced in the particular settlement, even though, again, the products that you would have gotten from sheep and goat are sort of similar, but again, not quite, because, of course, sheep being used a lot more for wool, and wool being indeed one of the most important products at the time, because it would have been used for clothes and blankets and taken people an awful amount of time to do it. Because I've actually done it just for this. What I've done for this episode is I've actually invested in a spindle wheel, and I've got some fleece from the sheep, the Manx Loughton, if that's how you pronounce it, that they keep at Butser Ancient Farm, which I've since visited from when we mentioned it in our first episode. So I got one of the little kits that they had there, and I thought, like, we'll try spinning wool. It takes a long time. I don't know how people in antiquity got anything done. You'll be like, oh, darling, did you manage to go hunt? To be like, no, I've been spinning wool all day. Just, I've only made 10 centimetres worth. What's a centimetre? I don't know. Okay.
Just to go back for a bit, though.
Yes, milk and meat. Yeah, milk
well,
and
I was
meat.
just saying, it might be good to also just real quick ID what a spindle whorl is for the audience, because not everyone will probably know.
I've taken some photographs of me attempting and failing at spinning wool, and it's an instrument. It would have been made out of a variety of materials, but it's a stick with a roly thing at the end. But it's got a hook on top which you attach the fleece onto, and then essentially by spinning it round, you'll spin the wool into actual yarn.
Sounds pretty boring.
It takes some time, but yeah, wool.
Just shows you tenacity of past peoples, I guess.
Well, you gotta get dressed for winter.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that's motivation enough to do it. Is you could either spin wool, take ages, or freeze to death.
Yeah, well, it's either that or making sort of boundaries, like with wooden fences and things. Because imagine like doing that with just like rods and withies and just like weaving, or like even like basketry. And it's great. I wish to learn all of that one day, because it's good. I think it's very good that we keep these traditions alive and these crafts, but also, oh boy, it takes some time. Like, yeah, hats off to everyone that does it and is keeping the tradition alive, because it's just,
We're just not made for it. It is pretty cool, though. And also, talk a bit more about, like, going to Butser Farm, because you saw the goats there, didn't you?
Sorry. I just think of, I love the goats over there.
I'm so jealous. I saw the pictures. They look great.
I'm just like, I'm struggling to articulate a little bit, but I really loved both the sheep and the goats, and Sandy loved the sheep and the goats to the point at which we had to take her away, because she had never met a sheep or a goat before. And of course, she's a herding breed. They are the reason she's alive. So saying that she really liked them would be an understatement. No, I really enjoyed meeting the sheep and goats, also because unlike other sort of ancient farms like Fengate, which we also discussed in the first episode, they like to keep sort of ancient breeds. And of course, what is meant by ancient breed is that it's not exactly, the same sheep they would have had in the Neolithic, but probably like close
enough, yeah, I think.
Close enough. And so they had traditional breeds. So they had Manx Loughton for sheep, and they had traditional English goats, which I particularly liked because their marking on the coats, it reminded me a lot of antelopes. And I befriended one of the goats to the point in which I decided to paint a portrait of her until 4 a.m. And so I just gave her lots of chin scratches, which I'm sure is of no relevance to anyone who's listening to the podcast, but I did really enjoy that goat, and she seemed to enjoy my company. So,
well, to be fair though, it's a great example of if anyone's really interested in learning more about past sheep and goat species, Butzer Farm is a great place to visit.
I swear they're not paying us to talk about it.
I wish they were. Are you kidding me? I'd also wish they pay for me to go visit because I'm broke.
I'll take you down at some point.
Oh, thanks. But yeah, no, it's similar to what there's a bunch of sheep in the Orkneys as well, who are kind of like an old, like, breed of sheep that specifically is known for eating seaweed.
Oh, you get sheep eating seaweed down in Romney Marsh as well, so in the southwest.
Okay.
Mainly do that, but there's a few sort of primitive / rare breeds about, at least in Britain. So you got the Manx was probably not Loughton, it'd be Manx Luden. Mm-hmm. I'm not entirely sure how to pronounce it. Please, like I said, the breed is native to the Isle of Man. So please, if there's anyone listening from the Isle of Man, tell me how to pronounce it. And, and they're supposed, much like some of the Orkney sheep, are meant to descend from the primitive sheep ones found sort of in Shetland, Scotland, the Hebrides, and you have you got your own Shetland breed and Hebridean breed. However you pronounce it. Not a native speaker. Please don't shoot the non-native speaker. And of course you have the Sowie, which they keep at Fengate, which are, again, a primitive sheep, and the way you can tell is that they're kind of small and stocky-ish. Yeah, they have sort of coarse hair. But essentially, with ancient sheep breeds, okay, they won't be exactly same as, but again, close enough, because they're the closest to what they would have looked like sort of back in the day. So some of them do indeed sort of very loosely descend, supposedly, from the sheep that were first brought into Britain during the Neolithic, because that might come as a shocker to a lot of people, that sheep are not native to Britain, like, not even by chance, just no. And I think with that, we are going to take a short break, but when we come back, we will be talking more about sheep and goats and how we can tell if they're in our assemblages. And scratch our chin some more.
Shop Plato's Closet tax-free August 2nd through 4th for back-to-school styles. We sell the trendy, gently used styles you need to make a difference in the world and in your wallet for back-to-school shopping. Save up to 70% off regular retail prices by choosing recycled styles. Save even more when you shop tax-free this weekend. Make a change that others can respect and repeat. Shop Plato's Closet in North Charleston and West Ashley this year for your back-to-school looks. Plato's Closet, located in West Ashley on Sam Rittenberg Boulevard and North Charleston on Rivers Avenue.
Back-to-school savings are officially in session at Tanger Outlets. Shop tax-free August 2nd through 6th and save up to 70% off the latest school styles. The best of apparel, footwear, accessories, and more. Save at Nike Factory Store, American Eagle, Gap Outlet, Crocs, Under Armour, Banana Republic Factory, and hundreds more. There's always something happening. Discover the latest fun and events all season long. Tanger Outlets, your savings destination.
All right, and we're back with episode 4 of Archaeo Animals. We're talking about sheep and goats. And so just to start off this next segment, let's kind of talk more about, where they're actually from, because again, they're really important to how we understand domestication. So of course, we'd want to understand where they're actually from. So Simona, if you want to take that.
Well, I guess in terms of the domestication of sheep and goats itself, it'll be a lot of the same stuff that's been mentioned for other domesticates and dogs in the previous episode. That, of course, even though we can speculate on when and where they were domesticated based on the first evidence that we found, it is more than likely that both species were actually domesticated in different areas. Different attempts were made during different time periods. The dog is chewing on my headphones. That's fine. She's just very keen on the topic. But of course, from the evidence we have, we presume that sheep descend from the mouflon, whose scientific name is Ovis orientalis, and they're supposedly domesticated around 11,000 to 9,000 BC. So among the earliest, right after dogs. And that's supposed to take place sort of in the Near East, because let's face it, all domestications have essentially taken place in the Near East. After they were domesticated sort of in that region, sheep husbandry just like spread like wildfire across like Eastern Europe and Western Europe. And as we mentioned before, of course, sheep are a very sort of reliable staple domesticate, because they're just good happily, grazing away on low grassland. Because that's one of the differences I forgot, is that sheep graze, goats browse.
Is that real? I had no idea about that. That also sounds ridiculously fake.
I'll put something about that in the show notes if I can find it.
Yeah.
While goats were domesticated, supposedly sort of around a similar time period in Southwest Asia, maybe Southeastern Europe as well. And of course, compared to sheep, they're hardier, more versatile, require less care than sheep would. And, they're happy enough just in poor soil conditions. So they're a nice all-round animal. They're still sort of more widespread in the southern part of Europe compared to northern Europe.
Yeah.
Because you tend to find them a lot more in the Mediterranean, even like where I'm from to this day, because they're just so reliable and then easygoing. But that might just be me, because I really like goats and I'm just very biased. But yeah, so that's more likely where sheep and goat come from. And of course, domestication taking an awful amount of time and happening in several locations. And again, as for dogs and other sort of main domesticates, it probably involved the corralling of young animals.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that just resulted into us having lovely, lovely, fluffy friends that are still friends with us to this day.
And they make up about 90% of zooarchaeology assemblages.
And probably life on Earth, minus cockroaches.
Oh, God, gross. I can't believe you would ruin this episode about adorable sheep with that.
I don't know, I've already lost it when I made yet another reference to Roman archaeology. And there's more to come, because of course, much like dogs, in the Roman period, they would have already had breeds of both sheep and goats, which of course wouldn't be the same breeds that we have now. I think we went down a rabbit hole in the previous episode about how you can't really discern breeds in the archaeological record, but breeds were indeed a thing. So I've had a little scout around the written record, and again, we're talking Roman stuff. And again,
forgive us for talking about Roman stuff.
Yeah. And again, what the ones I found so frequently being mentioned are like Ethiopians, Arabians, and white fleece sheep, goat-haired Ethiopians. Apparently, that's a thing. And Tarentines, which have not, which I presume will probably, correct me if I'm wrong, because literally off the top of my head, because that reminds me of a town in Italy called Taranto.
Okay.
Which I believe is in Apulia, so that might be where the breed came from. But please, if you're into sheep, tell me more about that.
We mean if you're into sheep, archaeology. But yeah, no, it's funny because I feel like when we talk about breeds, I think everyone immediately goes to dog. So it's always interesting to kind of talk more about breeds and different animals, like, as you say, sheep and goat.
Oh, because they would have had all sorts of, like, coming in a variety of colours, whether those were intended or not. And I guess the same with goats, but I think compared to sheep, goat breeds other than sort of the primitive goat, or at least for Britain anyway, more breeds didn't get established until much later on, which in a way sort of caused some trouble to the British primitive goat, which is, as the name suggests, sort of the closest thing we had to the goats of sort of brought over during the Neolithic. They would have had very coarse hair and big horns, but then from the 18th century they started like developing hornless breeds for very obvious reasons, because like sheep, goats are not always as mellow. They will ram into you if they so decide. They won't hurt much, but it's still, not pleasant.
Yeah.
So as they develop sort of hornless breeds, the primitive goat really suffered. So I think it's now classed as a rare breed because there's very few about, like just a few feral herds and captive individuals.
Mm-hmm.
But enough about breeds, and more about the bones, I guess.
Yeah, I was going to say, actually, speaking of, having hornless ones, I mean, that's one of the ways we can kind of pinpoint whether or not we've got sheep in our assemblages, at least for me. Although, of course, you can kind of confuse them with cattle horns.
Yeah, I guess you could. Yeah, and I think what the reason, because there are also hornless breeds, what makes it really tricky is when it comes to sexing, because of course we have sexual dimorphism is usually what it is a fairly good indicator of sex, and now the misconceptions that, of course, like, and it applies to cows as well, is that the males will have horns and the females won't. But then you get certain breeds where the females also have horns, and you get breeds where the males don't have horns.
Because, nothing can be simple.
Because life is difficult.
Yeah.
In fact, I was looking, like, in terms of discerning between sheep and goat bones. I do actually have a couple of bones scattered around here, including like 2 skulls. But the one sheep that I've got is hornless. So it's not being...
I've got plenty of horned sheep. I can always take a picture for the show notes if you want.
Because I think I've got a few horned ones, but they're in bubble wrap at the minute.
Fair enough.
So I've not properly unpacked the reference material. Although you can, at a glance, I guess the skull is one of the easier ones, more so than the teeth themselves, even though there are ways to distinguish between sheep and goat by looking at the teeth. Mm-hmm. What I actually find the best indicator in the skull is the nose, like the nasal bones. Because sheep tend to have sort of a Roman nose or a me nose. Because, of course, you will know what I look like. I've got, but my nose is as large as it is delicate, not unlike that of a sheep. While the goat noses tend to be more delicate, if that makes any sense at all.
No, I mean, that makes sense to me. I've found that when it comes to like what works for me personally with IDing animal bones, it's always something really weird like that, that
you will remember, like, by strictly the unscientific name, just like the distal end of metapodials for me are the roly bits.
I just like with metapodials, usually it's like the C and the D to tell the difference between a tarsum.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's just me like a child, basically, like making a letter with my hand and be like, oh, that matches. Very professional. Very great.
But I guess if you do have a horned sheep and a horned goat, the one way you could tell horns apart is that sheep horns tend to bend a bit more and be more parallel.
Yeah.
While goat horns will diverge and be like end in more of a point and sort of curve slightly less compared to sheep. And of course that is more reliable with ancient breeds because you would have had variation, but not to the point that we have today, because then, with sheep breeds now, like horn shapes have just gone wild. Another good indicator that I find is the cranial sutures. So I can't pronounce stuff properly because I never said half this stuff out loud before.
It's always the case.
But yeah, so I'm just I'm looking at the skull so right now, but in the cranial sutures, if you look in the occipital, so at the back of the skull, in sheep and goat, you'll find that there's more of a pentagon-like shape in sheep, while the goats will have like a weird reverse pentagon with curved sides. I'll post photos.
Yeah, don't worry. This sounds like wild to anyone listening, but we will post photos, so you could follow along, I guess, at home.
It's because we like to make it interactive. It's not because we don't know what we're talking about.
Yeah, unfortunately, we can't come to everyone's house with our reference collections.
I would love to.
Yeah, if anyone wants to host us, we'll come and show you exactly what we're talking about in person.
Oh, we could do that, like record like at listeners' houses. Like, today we're at Bob's house talking about dolphins.
please provide us dinner as well. That'd be great. I love free food. Well, actually, what I was going to talk about with sheep and goat remains, well, specifically sheep remains, is that, we talk about this whole episode, we've been talking about how sheep and goats are so similar that it's hard to differentiate. I also find that sheep and deer can be really difficult to differentiate.
Or red deer and cattle.
That too, yeah. But when it comes to like the mandibles, especially, because we don't live in a perfect world where we have nice whole intact bones. We get them in tiny little fragments, so that's the kind of stuff you end up dealing with, and fragmented at least. Sheep and deer mandibles look so similar sometimes, but at least the teeth look slightly different enough.
Oh, well, the one and again, a strictly unscientific indicator that I personally use to tell sheep and deer apart is that the teeth themselves, the sheep teeth tend to be a lot more straight edged.
Yeah, no, that's actually something I've used.
While I forgot what the name of the side is, because you have a lingual, I guess the buccal side of deer teeth tends to be bumpier.
Yeah. For those at home who don't know what buccal means, just a real quick definition.
It's the outside part of the mouth, not the one pointing towards the tongue.
The tongue, yeah. But yeah, no, that's kind of actually how I see it as well, which is super helpful. But if you get a mandible with no teeth and just like the actual shape, I mean, luckily deer mandibles tend to be more curved, I find, and sheep tend to be a bit more straighter.
Yeah, and I guess like in terms of unless you get a juvenile or something, in terms of size, if you're dealing with British archaeology, at least you don't really get fallow deer, which of course is the one whose size is perhaps closer to sheep, because then you have roe deer, but it's much too small. Of course, red deer is much too big, and fallow deer wasn't really in the country, because fallow deer is technically, we'll get to it in a later episode, but fallow deer is technically native to Britain.
Yeah. As
in, it was here during the last ice age, but then went extinct. So there's been a number of reintroductions over time, but it wasn't really until the Norman period that a breeding sort of viable fallow deer population was established. So if you look in sort of the earlier assemblages, you're not as likely perhaps to confuse deer and sheep.
See, with me, lucky me, I get juvenile deer and adult sheep. So
at least you're getting wild animals, so that's wild.
True. I mean, we'll probably have an episode where I talk more about the garbage that I'm going through, but
the labors of Alex.
It really is. Let me tell you. Honestly,
it was a cold and stormy day at the office.
It actually was today, but I mean, to be fair, I'm kind of sick of going through sheep these days. There's a lot of sheep I'm going through in my assemblage right now, but thankfully it's now a kind of I wouldn't say expert. I would never say I'm an expert of anything, but I'm pretty good now at IDing sheep and occasionally goat.
Well, then you can tell me a bit more about, because if you're taking anything away from this episode, is that to tell apart sheep and goat requires a very keen eye and the skill that I lack.
It tends to take about, I don't know, 3 or 4 cups of coffee for me to really get into it.
And then, of course, again, much like for any domesticate, there's also the local variation and breed variation, just to spice it up, because it wasn't hard enough as it was.
Yeah, like basically what we want you to take away from this episode, as well as this podcast in general, is that what sounds like it's kind of easy ends up being really, really difficult as you get into the nitty-gritty, which, of course, we need to get into the nitty-gritty if we want to, know enough about the past. But man, it's a headache.
Exactly, because as we said, they can tell us so much about the environment, the economy, and they're just cute.
They are cute.
That's half the reason why I'm into Zoo Arc, because I just love all animals.
I mean, they're dead animals, so it's not like,
But it's a nice way, because I know technically we're using the animals to reconstruct the lives of past people, but in the way, like, the reason why I got into it is more like it's for the animals themselves in a way, because you give them a voice, because there's been enough sort of, there's been a good amount of research on, human osteology and things, but the animals just tend to be sort of left aside. No one tells the animal story.
No, that's definitely true. I mean, even like what we were talking about with sheep and goat bones, like it's only been like within the past couple of decades that we've really gotten into differentiating between the two with different methodology, because before zooarchaeology was really a discipline no one really cared enough that you would tally the number of faunal animals and kind of call it a day. So if anything, you could see this as an example of just kind of how the discipline became, a quote unquote proper discipline.
And I guess to give you like a very, very quick idea about how we can discern, gain inference on economy. I just love that sentence, just gain inference. It's probably wrong as well. But a good way to get information about the economy of a particular settlement is again looking at domesticates, and by looking at sheep and goats in particular, by aging the animals, you can actually get what is called a kill-off pattern. So based on at what age an animal was culled, and also based on sex, you can sort of speculate on what type of economy was practiced at the site. So say like you have a site with a lot of sheep, but they were mostly adults when they died, chances are they were using them for wool. Now, if a lot of what you find is subadults, so like sort of when the animal reaches an optimum weight in which like you'll gain more weight if it gets a bit older, but it's not as economically viable for the amount of extra meat you're getting in return, then, as I've already hinted, chances are they were using them for meat. So as soon as you get to the subadult stage, okay, it's big enough, it's not going to grow much more, so guess we'll just eat it. And with milk, of course, like it all sounds pretty obvious, but you'll find that a lot of the juveniles that you find are males, because of course they would have culled the males and kept the females for milk. But of course, there is trouble with making these assumptions, because chances are settlements probably had, their herds were probably multifunctional and getting different products out of them. And there is an inherent bias, because juvenile bones are quite porous, they don't preserve as well. So chances are maybe not finding as many juveniles, not because they weren't there, they weren't part of the death assemblage, it's just they've not preserved as well. And also there's a host of sort of perinatal mortality factors of just because animals just die. I mean, life was harsh enough for people, let alone the domesticates that would have been kept by the people. So, but yeah, just a little taster of things you could speculate and argue based on the sex and age that you get in your assemblage.
Yeah, and you know what? In the next segment coming up, we'll be having our first interview, and we'll be kind of talking more about putting these kind of ideas into motion on an actual archaeological site. So we're going to take a little break, and we'll be back with a nice little interview about sheep and goats.
Well, just sheep.
Just sheep, okay.
No goats. I think I've talked enough about goats. But yeah, break!
Shop Plato's Closet tax-free August 2nd through 4th for back-to-school styles. We sell the trendy, gently used styles you need to make a difference in the world and in your wallet for back-to-school shopping. Save up to 70% off regular retail prices by choosing recycled styles. Save even more when you shop tax-free this weekend. Make a change that others can respect and repeat. Shop Plato's Closet in North Charleston and West Ashley this year for your back-to-school looks. Plato's Closet, located in West Ashley on Sam Rittenberg Boulevard and North Charleston on Rivers Avenue.
Back-to-school savings are officially in session at Tanger Outlets. Shop tax-free August 2nd through 6th and save up to 70% off the latest school styles. The best of apparel, footwear, accessories, and more. Save at Nike Factory Store, American Eagle, Gap Outlet, Crocs, Under Armour, Banana Republic Factory, and hundreds more. There's always something happening. Discover the latest fun and events all season long. Tanger Outlets, your savings destination.
Hello and welcome back to Archaeo Animals. With you is your very lonely host, Simona Falanga. Alex has unfortunately been stricken by the plague, so she's not going to be around for this while this interview is being recorded. Of course, you're more than welcome to send her a feel well soon gift. I'll suggest in the form of maybe fish bones or some pig teeth, because we know she loves them very much. You may notice that I don't sound terribly well myself, and that's because I'm currently recovering from this very same plague that's been going around while the interview was being recorded. But it appears I may not be torn out of my flesh prison just yet, as in I won't. I'll live. I'll be fine. But yes, today we actually have a real human guest. That speaks and everything, not just animals randomly meowing and trying to nibble my ear while I'm trying to record. So if you'd like to say hello to our guest.
Yeah, hi, my name is Albina.
Oh, hello, Albina, and thank you for coming to the show. It's really I can't stress it because, as I said, I'm an awkward cucumber, but it's very exciting to have someone speak about what I think is a very fascinating subject that I personally know very, very little about, so please bear with me. And Albina is here today to discuss her research titled The Horses and Sheep of the Vikings, Archaeogenomics of Domesticates in the North Atlantic.
Yes.
So, Albina, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself a little bit and telling ourselves and our listeners a bit more about, yourself and what you do. And
yeah, so my name is Albina and I'm actually Icelandic and I'm based in Iceland. I work at the Agricultural University of Iceland, which is... I like to call it a micro university. We're not a very big university, and we're mostly focused on sort of agricultural education. But there's also research, both applied and sort of curiosity-driven research. But I'm also a PhD student at the University of Oslo, and that's where my project is actually sort of most of the lab work and stuff takes place there. I initially did my BA in archaeology at the University of Iceland, and then I went on to New York and did a master's in zooarchaeology. So I'm a trained zooarchaeologist and now sort of a geneticist in training, I guess. And yeah, so that's sort of, it's a very interesting sort of divide to straddle, moving from the humanities to more of a, I guess, a pure sort of science field. And it's interesting often sort of the tensions that can come up because the traditions are so different within the humanities and then within sort of the hard sciences. And there's a lot of archaeologists are very wordy. All of our articles are very long and very, we like to use our words. And then biologists and geneticists, they love to write articles that are 2,000 words. So it's very interesting. And sometimes it's really, really challenging to try to sort of meld those two disciplines. And we really want the project that we're working on to be a very sort of interdisciplinary project that sort of is melding sort of the best of archaeology and sort of ancient genetics.
Interdisciplinary projects are the best kind of projects, really.
Yeah.
If you just do the one thing, it gets boring after a while, but it's just a breath of fresh air when you incorporate so many disciplines together. And I'm of the idea that you can always learn something new and from anything and anyone, regardless of their background. There's always some opportunities to learn. And not entirely sure where I'm going with this, but learning is great, and interdisciplinary stuff is also great.
Yeah. I always sometimes I've taught kids about archaeology, and I always like to say, the past is everything that has happened up until now, and we just need all of the tools in the toolbox to understand the past. And that includes humanities and hard sciences, genetics, archaeology, history, pretty much everything. We need all the tools to be able to understand the past, because the past is so complicated, but it's so important for us to understand. So I really think that and archaeology in many ways, I think, is just by nature a very interdisciplinary science that has always used methods from other sciences to try to work on archaeological questions. So in some ways, I think what's happening now with interdisciplinarity being so popular really is just really something that had already been going on in archaeology for decades, but it's just now being like sort of people are using their words more to sort of identify it in a more sort of formal way. So yeah, I feel like it's sort of yeah.
And I almost forgot as well. I want to thank you for being here, by the way, and I'm sure Alex extends her thanks.
Yes, thank you for inviting me.
No, it's great to have you here.
I've really enjoyed it. I've listened to a few episodes of the podcast, and I've really enjoyed it. So I think it's great. It's a good format, I think. So
how have you been listening to it and still accepted to come here? Well, thank you very much. And as I said, it would be really interesting because it's a subject that I personally know very little about because, as I mentioned in previous episodes as well, my background is in commercial archaeology. So I'm not even a trained zoo archaeologist. I'm just really, I persevere a lot. So no, it'll be very interesting. And for the listeners out there, other than my mother and Alex's mother, Albina is here to discuss her research titled The Horses and Sheep of the Vikings, Archaeogenomics of the Domesticates in the North Atlantic. So first of all, could you please tell us a little bit more about archaeogenomics and what it involves, just for the layman like myself?
Yeah, so archaeogenomics is basically, it's ancient DNA research. And what ancient DNA research is all about is using genetic methods to look at old things. So in our project, we're mostly working with bones, so bones from archaeological excavations that we then sample and do, to see if there's any genetic material there. And then in the cases where we do have genetic material, which is not every bone still has any DNA left, lots of, for various reasons, some bones just don't really have any DNA, and about 50% of them work. And then we take the genetic information there and compare the samples to each other and to modern samples as well. Just and sort of how the genetics of sheep and horses in the past have changed. And the sort of the time frame that we're working with is sort of from the settlement of the North Atlantic. So Iceland is settled around 870, and we really want to understand like where the sheep and horses that were brought to Iceland initially came from. And we're also looking at the Faroes in Greenland, who were also settled by the Vikings around the 9th, 10th century. So that's sort of the goal of the project. But we also, what we are doing in our project is we're doing whole genome sequencing, which means that we're looking at the whole genome of the animal. A lot of sort of previous ancient DNA studies have only looked at the mitochondrial genome, and the mitochondria are sort of the, I guess, energy factories of our cells. So everybody has lots of them in their cells, so that's usually easier to find. It's better preserved in old material than the nuclear DNA, which is like all of our DNA. But the mitochondrial genome only comes from the mother's side. So you can only get sort of half of the story. But if you look at the nuclear genome, which is, I guess you can sort of say like the recipe for how to build a sheep or a human or a horse, then you get the information from both the mother and the father, and it just tells you so much more. And it has a lot more detail and more resolution than if you're only looking at the mitochondrial genome. So there haven't been any published studies of whole genome sequencing of sheep, ancient whole genome sequencing of sheep before. There's been quite a few mitochondrial studies, which sort of, depending on the time period and region, have been informative. But we really hope that by looking at the whole genome, we can actually tell a lot more. And we also hope to be able to understand more sort of about the traits of the animals. So, for example, color is something that we'll hopefully be able to say something about. Also, hornedness and polled. So if the sheep had horns or if it didn't have horns. But we can only, there's certain things that we can say about sort of what traits these animals in the past had, but only the traits that we know the genetic basis for. So actually, ancient DNA is really, really heavily reliant on the work that's been done on modern genetics of, for example, sheep. And because sheep are, they're an important agricultural species, and humans have been using them for thousands of years. but they are not as sort of high value as, for example, cattle, and don't have the same status as horse. So there's actually somewhat less work been done on sheep genetics than, for example, on cattle and horse. So that also limits us in a little bit, because we really need to have sort of this basic information we need to get from studies of modern sheep that we can then look and compare to the past. Does that make sense?
It does. Yeah. And also I imagine like the modern sample will be huge, because you have so many, even if you exclude some of the more commercial breeds and you just look at the ancient and rare breeds, like there's such a huge modern sample that we have so many weird and wonderful breeds. There's just, where do you start?
Yeah, that's but it's actually interesting that there's actually very, very few whole genomes of modern sheep that have been published and that are accessible online. They're really very, very few. And we actually, for our project, are actually also doing some sequencing of modern Icelandic sheep, modern Faroese sheep, and modern Norwegian breeds to compare to our ancient material, because that has not been published in an accessible way before. And that's actually one of the interesting things about working with a breed of animal that's sort of currently being used in agriculture, because there's lots of genetic work being done on pretty much all domestic livestock species, modern ones, for agricultural purposes. But because, agriculture is an industry, so a lot of the information that comes out of that is proprietary. So we actually can't get access to it. And also some of the ways that they, this is going to get a little bit technical. I'll try to have it sort of not go too deep into it. But for a lot of like sort of breeding studies in modern domestic animals, people use what are called SNP chips. So they're sort of these little, they're sort of designed to look at only specific parts of the genome. So they have selected the parts of the genome that they're most interesting agriculturally to like improve the effectiveness of breeds, and so people can make more money and be more efficient in their farming and breeding. And for the sheep, the SNP chip that people use the most is a 50K SNP chip. And that actually, the whole genome of the sheep is like 3.2 gigabytes or something. And 50K, that's only 50,000 SNPs. A SNP is like a single base pair a single base in the genome. So it actually is only a tiny fragment really of the whole story. So we can't really use that very much when we're trying to look into the past, because it just doesn't have enough information. So there's a lot of that kind of information available, but actually not a lot of these sort of whole genome, where people have taken a genome of a single sheep and sequenced all of it.
Yeah, that's from what I understand, the sort of current research and material modern breeds is almost selective, because essentially you're just picking out the bits that are relevant to the industry and to make the breed more efficient and make more money, but you're not necessarily looking at traits that we might be interested in seeing sort of in archaeological terms.
Exactly. And the things also with sheep, like most of the genetic work that's being done now is done on, for example, merino sheep. And they are really quite far away from sort of these Northern European short-tailed sheep breeds, which are always sort of considered to be, I guess, in some ways more primitive sheep breeds that have been bred less. And that would cover like the Icelandic sheep and the Faroese sheep and most of these sort of local sheep breeds in the northwest of Europe. So it's actually very likely that some of these things that people have studied really intensively for the merino sheep just don't really translate very well when you're looking at the genetics of these sort of short European short-tailed breeds that have not been bred so intensely and have very different properties in many ways. So
just completely out of interest. So the traditional breeds, say, found in Iceland, do they look anything like sort of the traditional British breeds that will have sort of short-tailed, quite small?
Yeah, they look, so if people are familiar with soy sheep, they're kind of similar to those. Although today, actually in the 20th century, the Icelandic sheep was bred quite intensely and actually had very successful breeding programs in sort of modifying the breed to the standards, to make more meat and have better wool and things like that. So actually in Iceland now, most sheep are white, although there's also a huge variety of color still present within the breed, because Icelandic farmers have always been interested in colorful sheep, even when the wool was less valuable, the colored wool. And also Icelandic sheep are also really interesting because so in Iceland we have both polled females, so females with no horns, females with horns, polled males, and males with horns. So we have which is unusual. A lot of modern sheep breeds are either completely polled, so neither sex has horns, or only the males have horns, for example. So there's relatively few breeds that still exist that have this really sort of phenotypic variety. So a large sort of lots of different looking animals with different colors and different shapes and sizes of horns and those kinds of things. So that's actually one of the really interesting things about Icelandic sheep is sort of this sort of phenotypic variability. And that applies also to, I guess, most of the Icelandic domestic animals, actually. The Icelandic cow also has lots of different colors, although now most of them don't have horns, but horns used to be very common until the 20th century. And in the Icelandic horse as well is famous for, having multiple gaits and also having lots of different colors and really huge variety in color, and also a little bit of variety in size. So that's actually an interesting thing about Icelandic livestock breeds specifically is sort of this variety in color, partially because sort of systematic breeding didn't really start until the 20th century in Iceland. And there was never this sort of, because the breed, we only have one sheep breed in Iceland and one cow breed and one horse breed. So there was not, like you see, for example, in the UK, where there's maybe more regional differences, and then people were sort of breeding their animals to be sort of very uniform looking in different regions. In Iceland, the story is just very different. So it's actually, there's a lot of variety, which is interesting again, because Iceland is fairly isolated and it's fairly small, so you would actually expect there to be a lot of uniformity, but it's not like that. So that's one of the things that we find interesting and one of the reasons for why we're doing this research.
Because I think I read somewhere that you've taken samples from Jorvik as well.
Yeah. So for the sheep, we have samples from several excavations in Iceland and in Greenland and the Faroes and Norway. And I went to York, to the York Archaeological Trust, which was really nice and very helpful people there. And I took some samples from the Hungate excavation, actually. And those samples worked really well. So we really want to compare to that as well. So that'll be really interesting to see what comes out of that, because on the horse work that we had done previously showed that there's this mutation in the horse genome that codes for what are called ambling gaits, which the Icelandic horse is famous for. And the oldest instances of this sort of mutation are found in Iceland, and then also in a single specimen from York. So, and that date to roughly around the same time. And that was actually a very unexpected result, because people thought that this ambling gait mutation was a lot older and came from Mongolia and was probably thousands of years old. But it turned out to be, at least the oldest instances that have been found so far are only 9th century and have only been found in York and in Iceland in ancient horses. So that's very interesting, really.
Yeah, it would be interesting to look at also, because there's a British sheep breed that is presumably introduced by the Vikings. The Herdwick breed that's usually found sort of like in the northeast part of England. And I'm not sure whether any studies have been done on the breed per se, but they think purely because of some written evidence that they found in some manuscripts and the very name of the sheep, they think that Viking settlers have brought that breed with them. I just thought I'd throw that in there, but I actually have no idea whether any work has been done on that.
That actually, I did not. So that's, like you were saying before, there's so many different types of sheep. I had actually not heard of this breed before, and I will definitely need to look into this a little bit more. I'm looking just now on Wikipedia. It actually, it doesn't look very similar to Icelandic sheep in many, like the head shape is quite different, but I definitely need to look into this. But yeah, in the UK is so fascinating as well. I mean, yeah, I guess when you're driving around, you can mostly see the same breeds, but there are so many heritage breeds in the UK. Although obviously most of them are very sort of threatened and small and stuff. But yeah, the UK is interesting, sort of livestock breed wise. So.
I've met some Sowie because they have a flock at Fengate, which is sort of it's a museum, and it's got a reconstruction of a few Bronze Age sort of roundhouses and things in Peterborough, so in the East Midlands, I guess, and they've got a flock of Sowie. They're lovely.
Yeah,
they're escape artists though, apparently.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah, so I mean, sheep are. I really like sheep, and for Iceland, they are just so important because basically, there wouldn't be any people in Iceland and the Faroes if it wasn't for sheep. Because it's not like the Inuit in Greenland, which are real experts at utilizing skins and stuff to dress themselves. In Iceland and the Faroes, you don't have as much access to fur-bearing animals. So actually, and you really need clothes because it's cold and wet here pretty much all the time. So we really need sheep to survive here. And I mean, it's also just, it's interesting to me how little interest there has been in this actually in many ways, because in some ways you could say that there wouldn't have been a Viking Age without sheep, because you need the wool from sheep for the sails of the Viking ships. And the Vikings are, I mean, when you think of a Viking, the first thing I think of is a Viking ship. And you needed so much wool for the sail of a single Viking ship. So actually you could say that there wouldn't have been any Viking Age without sheep in many ways. So they're really, for me, they're really key to understanding how this process worked and where these people came from and how they were able to settle in these really kind of, in many ways, really difficult landscapes. But sheep really fit well into these sort of island ecosystems of Iceland and the Faroes. They're really, really well suited to these types of landscapes, and they're really. So it's actually a really interesting sort of how an animal that was domesticated, in the Middle East, how they sort of found this niche here in the North Atlantic where they really thrive.
Right, just one final question that Alex and I would like to ask all of our guests. What's your favourite bone?
I should probably say the sheep petrous bone. That's one of the bones of the skull from around the ear region, and that's actually the bone that we sample for our ancient DNA work. And actually, most people that are doing ancient DNA today are using the petrous bone. And it's interesting that petrous actually means stone, so it's a really hard bone, and that's why the DNA preserves really well there. But if you really pressed me, I'd have to say the sheep astragalus.
Yes.
And it's just such a pretty bone. And this has all these interesting uses in the past. People use it for divination, and it just fits well in the hand. And then it's also so archaeologically, you can use it a lot for measurements.
And it looks like a little toy car.
I know, it's just, yeah, that's my favorite. But actually the sheep petrous bone, actually I like a lot as well. And I generally think that sheep have the prettiest bones.
We'll allow two answers. Well, thank you very much for coming onto the show, Albina.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you everyone for listening. So we'll see you, hopefully with an Alex, on the next episode of Archaeoanimals. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Hey, this is Chris from the Archaeology Podcast Network. The bonus questions are available at the bonus content page at www.archpodnet.com/members. That's www.archpodnet.com/members. See you over there.
Thank you for listening to Archaeoanimals. Please subscribe and rate the podcast wherever you get your podcast from. You can find us on Twitter at Archaeoanimals. Also, the views expressed on the podcast are those of ourselves, the hosts and guests, and do not necessarily represent those of our institution, employers, and the Archaeology Podcast Network. Thanks for listening.
This show is produced and recorded by the Archaeology Podcast Network, Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle, in Reno, Nevada at the Reno Collective.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.
Thanks again for listening to this episode and for supporting the Archaeology Podcast Network. If you want these shows to keep going, consider becoming a member for just $7.99 US a month. That's cheaper than a venti quad eggnog latte. Go to archpodnet.com/members for more info.